is the need to have a greater distribution of care work between women and men. So that needs to be tackled. And it needs to be tackled in a number of ways, whether that's about providing increased paid paternity leave. It's also about addressing the low status in which care work is attributed. And it's also at a very high level in Irish society, looking at our constitution and amending that article on women in the home, which is very much an outdated reference to women's place in Irish society. But amending it to an inclusive statement about the importance of care, the value of care to our society, and care work done by both women and men. And we believe that recognising this would set a high value statement in terms of the importance of care, but also of the need to have both men and women and all in society engaged in that care piece. The second area is about investment in care, and the report makes a very strong case for a public model of care provision. And this is absolutely crucial in our view. And that must include investment in a public model of early years education. And that is similar to so many European countries, but is one in which Ireland falls way behind. And we also need to see investment in social care services like home care and personal assistance services for disabled people. Thirdly, we need to look at decent work. We need to focus on creating good jobs, but not jobs at any cost. As the report points out, care work needs to be well paid, so therefore it needs to be publicly resourced, and its wages need to be set above that what would be fetched in a private market economy. And in the early years, we need to see at the outset in Ireland, a living wage brought in as a first step towards professional pay scales. And it is very disappointing that only yesterday in our national budget for 21, there is no reference to this area. So there will be no increases. Also critical in here in terms of decent work is the role of collective bargaining. It's one of the most effective ways to create a more equal redistribution of wealth, reduce inequality and address low pay. And we've seen research that has indicated that countries with a high coverage of collective bargaining tend to have better working conditions, lower, smaller gender pay gaps, and also shorter working hours. And I also think we need to look at some innovative examples. For example, the work that's being led by migrant women in Ireland at the moment in the creation of the Great Care Co-op. And these are women who are developing collective and cooperative models of home care provision aimed at delivering better quality services with decent paying conditions for workers, and where profits are invested back into improving training for workers and pensions. These act as really good models. We also need to see far more care-friendly workplaces. So we need to see better facilitation of care and paid work. And a crucial part of that is also looking overall in the economy at the need for reduced working time. And that's why the National Women's Council, along with others, is part of the four-day working week campaign in Ireland, with trade unions and also with environmental organisations. So it is, as I've said, this is complex in terms of how we work towards really integrating care in a much greater way in our society. And there is no one solution, but we do need more provision of care services that have to be accompanied by decent pay, collective bargaining, flexible work practices, and paid statutory leave, so that women can remain connected to the labour market. And what's absolutely crystal clear is the need for public models of care provision if workers in the care sector are to have decent pay and working conditions. So I really want to thank Task for the report, because I think it shines a light on the care economy in Ireland that was so needed and is such an important contribution to our understanding of the importance of care to gender equality. And we really look forward to working with Task in terms of bringing forward, what is in the report. And I also look forward to hearing all of the different speakers, which I hope will be a lively discussion. So now I'm going to hand over to Mary Daly, and who's the moderator. And I know that Task are delighted that Mary could be the moderator for the launch today. Mary is a professor of sociology and social policy at Oxford University and is an expert in care systems, both in the EU and in Ireland. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's really my great pleasure to moderate this session, the remainder of it. care is a subject that's close to my heart. I've worked on it for over 20 years, and I think in COVID-19 times and even before COVID-19, it's such an important aspect of our lives and of the way we live and the way we work. So I'm delighted to be involved with TASK and also with the FES on this endeavour this morning. And can I thank Laszlo and can I thank Orla for a really excellent setting of the scene for our discussions this morning. It's so important that we keep talking about this for Ireland, and Ireland is, as Robert says in the report, a country that a lot of others can learn from, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a less positive way. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who is also the author of the report, and that's Robert Sweeney. And Robert is an economist working as a researcher and policy analyst at TASK. And since we have people who are not Irish here, TASK stands for Think Tank I had it written down, but it's, I think, Think Tank for Action on Socioeconomic Change. And Robert's going to give a short overview of what is indeed a really excellent report, very detailed, not just on Ireland, but also on the European Union. So Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Mary. I hope everybody can hear me fine. And let me just, I'll share my screen now. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about inequality and the care economy and the case of Ireland. So just the outline of the report is going to look at unpaid care work in Ireland and compare it to the EU, who actually does the care work in Ireland, and how the Irish state facilitates care, unpaid care versus paid care and paid employment, and then briefly look at the working conditions of early years workers and adult care workers. So just as a spoiler, my findings is that actually it might be a little bit surprising, is that the Irish welfare state does have significant transfers which facilitate unpaid care work, but at the same time it's low investment in public services, and especially childcare. Also acts as a barrier to those who would like to take up employment as well. And because of the low investment, the working conditions and pay of care workers tends to be poor as well. Okay, so this graph here looks at the distribution of time for EU countries. It's based on the European Quality of Life Survey. So time, and this is hours per week, and time can be divided into looking after children, looking after adults, domestic work, paid work is here, and then commuting. So if we look at just, and the countries are aligned according to the amount of time they spend on unpaid care work. And we see that here, Ireland actually does the most unpaid care work in the European Union. So Irish people do about 14 hours of childcare per week and almost 3 hours of adult care per week. And this is more than any other country in the European Union. And if you look at here, like this one here, when you add it all up, this can be thought of the amount of time on total work. And Irish people do spend quite a lot of time on total work as well. But there are other countries who spend more time at work, such as Romania, Latvia. And there's a variety of factors that impinge on this. One is that Ireland has a young demographic structure, so it has more children to look after. So that would be a factor as well. But as I will hope to demonstrate and discuss, it's also low levels of investment in childcare means that a lot of the care work that goes on in Ireland is unpaid, basically. Okay, so this looks at the distribution of work, both unpaid and total work. So here we see this is men and women in aggregate here, and we see that This is looking after children, looking after adults, domestic work, paid, and then commuting, just like before. And we see that women unsurprisingly do the vast majority of unpaid care work. So women do on average 21 hours of unpaid care work, and men do on average 12. But if we look at the distribution of total work, it's more even. Women do 54 versus men doing 51. And then we can divide that, look at this again, the dividing according to income group. So this is like Q1 is those in the bottom 25% of the income distribution, and Q4 is those in the top quarter. And what we see is that the gender gap in unpaid work tends to be strongest among those middle income households. So we see in Q2 here that women do, a very large amount of unpaid care work, whereas men don't do so much. And also for middle income households as well, the gender gap in total work tends to be highest. It tends to be, the distribution of unpaid care work tends to be more even among lower income households. I'm a bit skeptical about this figure here, but nevertheless, it does suggest that the gender gap in unpaid care work is lower among lower income households. And we see that among the higher income households, the distribution of unpaid care work is actually quite even. Women still do a little bit more, but it's not that much more. And the most likely reason is because the more money, if you're in a high income household in the top quarter, you're more able to afford childcare. So that women in particular, they are less, I don't want to use the word burden, but you know what I mean. They have to do less unpaid care of children. And we also see that the distribution of total work is quite different among higher income families as well. So this looks at the Irish welfare state in comparative perspective here. And what I have done is I look at welfare spending on family and children. And this can be divided into a number of things, cash transfers such as child benefit, services, which is mostly childcare, and also tax breaks and so on. So it might come as to some people surprise that Ireland actually is among the most, if not the most generous in terms of its spending on family children. But this is overwhelmingly a result of spending on transfers. And I mean, there are issues with comparing Ireland to other countries because GDP isn't a very reliable indicator in Ireland. So we have this alternative measure called GNI star. But nevertheless, it does show that Ireland does spend quite a lot. However, there are consequences to its reliance on transfers and its lack of investment in services. So this shows how much income. It's the so-called effective tax rate for a lone parent with 2 children. That's what it's called by the OECD. It shows how much income a typical single parent with 2 children would give up upon entering employment. So if you are a lone parent and you enter employment, there's many ways in which you give up the income that you receive from work. So you get less benefits, you have to pay taxes, and you also have to pay childcare fees. And we see that at 59%, the effective tax rate in Ireland is toward the high end by European Union standards. And I'm surprised this isn't higher actually in Ireland. So for the typical lone parent, it means that almost 3/5 of their earnings are lost when they take up employment. And this is predominantly a result of high childcare fees. So that's a major barrier to taking up paid work. And I'm not suggesting that lone parents have to take up paid work, but it's just useful to know that. Here, this figure here shows investment in the early years or childcare sector, but I think most people prefer the term early years. This is a little bit dated, as 2016, and Ireland has increased its investment in recent years. And we see that Ireland is among the lowest spender in the European Union. And in this year, it was actually the lowest spender. And a consequence of this is its high reliance on the informal care sector. So what this shows is where children spend their time, basically, where all children spend their time when they're not being cared for in the family, basically. And we see that, again, this relates to 2016, and it's probably changed a little bit, but we see that when they're not being cared for by the family, say preschool children, they're being looked after by childminders and au pairs, more so than spending time in informal settings, basically. So a consequence of the low investment in childcare is the fact that the childcare costs are high in Ireland, and the result of that is that Ireland has high reliance on the informal sector, whether that's childminders or au pairs. Okay, another consequence of low investment in services is that the working conditions of the carers are poor. So care is different to other types of work in that it is both time and labor intensive, and it can't be automated. You know, you have to, take care, so to speak, when you're doing care. And so if you want good wages in the sector, you need to have high levels of public investment. But here are just some quick statistics on early years work in Ireland. It is 98% female. The average wage is just €12.55 per hour, which is a little bit above the living wage. Only half have permanent jobs, and around a fifth are unionized. There isn't exact up-to-date figures on that, but it's believed that only a fifth are unionized. If we look at the adult care sector, it's a similar story. Now, cross-country comparisons on spending in adult care are difficult. It's difficult to get reliable figures about that. But we see that it's 92% female. Most of them are working in nursing homes and home care. Approximately €12 per hour. There's high levels of precariousness, and only a fifth are unionized. And I go into this in the report. There's also been, gradual privatization of the sector. So, for instance, Irish state spending on home care on private providers was only 1% in 2006, but now 2/5 or 40% of public spending on home care is now goes to private providers, which tends to drive down paying conditions in the sector as well. So just in conclusion, Ireland is highly reliant on unpaid care work. This is facilitated by welfare transfers, and it's also facilitated by low investment in services, which leads to reliance on the informal sector, informal paid sector. The expense of childcare erects barriers to employment if people do want to take up work. And it also makes the low investment makes early years work low paid and unattractive, and adult care is also low paid and unattractive work as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was a very good summary of what is a very detailed report. I would really recommend it if people could read it, and I hope it'll be published in journal articles or even in some other kind of web format that can get public access, because I think what it does is shine a light on aspects of the care economy, both in Ireland, but also in Europe more broadly, that we haven't known about before, really. And not just that, but you also make some recommendations for policy change. And it's clear from the report and also from what Orla's really powerful presentation that we need fundamental change in Ireland in relation to care and valuing care. We now move on to a panel discussion, and there are some changes in the lineup. I'm delighted that Jennifer Carroll McNeil is with us. Robert will also join this panel discussion, and I will also join when I have some questions or some comments to make. Could I also invite people to pose questions via the chat or also via live on YouTube? We have maximum half an hour if we're to keep to time. And I would like to open the floor to Jennifer first. And Jennifer is a Fine Gael Member of Parliament, and Fine Gael is one of the parties in government at the moment. And she's a Dublin-based Member of Parliament and has a history of prioritizing, working with families, but prioritizing especially homeless families, which is a huge problem in Ireland. We were just talking about it before we started, and also domestic abuse awareness. So Jennifer, the floor is yours for whatever comments you'd like to offer us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and it's wonderful to have you involved in this. And thank you to Robert for this really excellent report. And it was a pleasure to go through it. It was a pleasure to have it presented as well by Robert. It's such an excellent report and such an important piece of work at this time. And I think Orla's response is a really important one. I'm hoping she's going to email me her speech so that I can have better notes than the ones I took. So I come to this as a Fine Gael TD, as somebody who's been involved in the political system for quite a long time, but reflecting it from my own personal experience as a carer for part of my life, and also somebody perhaps coming from a more private sector background in some respects, and trying to continually reflect the experience that my constituents have, that a huge cohort of women who are professional in the private sector and are also experiencing these care challenges. And it's just a different story sometimes than some of the ones that are presented. Perhaps there's a higher concentration of that experience in my constituency, but I think it's a valuable perspective and one that we don't hear quite enough about. I think overall in the round, that experience of private sector, the experience. I think, what this report produces to us is yet another challenge for gender justice, yet another challenge to how we have managed the pay and crucially the pension problem for women, full participation in the workforce and full participation in the totality of civic life, and the availability, as Orla was saying, about the ability to participate, to have the time to participate in further study, or even frankly, let's just call it as it is, reading a book in peace and having the opportunity to have enough time to do that. Because a lot of the people whom we're talking about are working all day and doing everything else in the evening time. So the idea that you get to a point where you can participate again in the totality of life is very appealing and very far away for a lot of the people whom we're speaking about. When I was thinking about the care sector, and of course you've split it up there into paid and unpaid, and the paid care sector is one. If I could just set that aside for 1 second and just consider the unpaid sector. And again, I have it in my mind in two ways. You have one, carers who are delivering what we might call critical care or health-based care. And then of course you have the day-to-day sort of care that many families are engaged in on a day-to-day basis. There is another group of carers whom I discovered from my own experience, who are carers without realizing that they're carers. And so, for example, it's the parent who would have gone back to work, but whose child has a very significant health issue, as in my own case. And it was only, I would have stayed home with my son for a very long time because of his health challenges. It never occurred to me that I was a carer. I never classified myself in that way. And it was only many years later when I was helping a master's student with her research about carers, that it occurred to me that I had fit into that without being able to competently name it, without understanding my position in it. And of course, what that means is if I am doing that, there are of course lots of other people who are performing care work and who are in many respects full-time carers without naming that or without understanding that that is so. And of course, that contributes to a lack of political representation for that voice. And of course, that contributes to a lack of policy responsiveness for that voice, because if you can't even name it for yourself, you certainly can't do it on behalf of people. Then, you come to the other part of life. I go back to, some of my friends. I always think of one in particular who's she's a partner in a Dublin law firm. She's a single mom. She's got two school, but primary school age boys, and she just does everything all the time. And yes, she's in a higher earning bracket, and she has, she can afford an au pair to pick up her children after school. But really, she has absolutely no time to do anything beyond fulfill her professional obligations, earn enough money to keep her house, and look after her children in the way. Now, but she doesn't. The ancillary care that's involved, whether it's in a single parent family or whether it's in a two-parent family, the ancillary work that you've named in the report around whether it's making meals or what we often describe as the mental load that is unequally distributed among the genders, making sure there's the tracksuit, fixing the this, fixing the that, the name tags, all of those things, the dentist appointment next week, all of those things which take from this idea of having any space for oneself or one's own intellectual space in the day, this idea of being able to ever read a book in some peace and with sufficient space in one's mind to be able to absorb and really think about it. And one of the phrases I was just thinking in the report, which I find challenging, is this, and it isn't meant this way, but when you look at it, the preferences, the distribution of preferences between the genders in terms of the care-work balance, as though it were as though it were uniquely a matter of preference, which of course it isn't, and the degree to which that is preferences, and the degree to which it's a socialized experience and a socialized set of expectations. And then I find myself thinking about the women who come to me and say that, they want to pick up their kids at 3 o'clock. They don't want to have additional childcare. They want to spend the time. And of course, that's a preference, but that they are not being accommodated in a sufficient way by the labour force, by the market economy, to be able to provide their professional services in a 20-hour-a-week way. And that when they present themselves to corporates, on that basis that they're available between 9 and 3, they'll do a perfectly good job. They have oodles of 10 years experience and everything else to be able to perform, whether it's marketing functions or accountancy functions or whatever it happens to be, but that their constraint is a time constraint, that the market isn't accepting of that. And that's a really big challenge, because when you get to that point about the luxury of being able to articulate my preference is and my own budgeting situation and my preference married together mean that this is the optimum solution for me and for my family for a significant period, and then not to have that accepted by the labour force is deeply problematic. And it's not sufficient that the professional markets don't respond that way, and it only contributes to the marginalisation of professional women and to working women, and makes it even more difficult.
Jennifer, have you more? I mean, I might ask you to summarize briefly. Yeah,
there was just when you consider about the caring, the sharing, the caring opportunity or the care burden, whichever way you come to that, it's a different experience, I think. Sorry, why don't you go on and we'll take the different questions. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. I really appreciate that you bring to life, the carers. You talk about real people, and I think sometimes when we have these sessions, we don't really talk enough about real people. So thank you very much for that. I mean, I'll just follow up on one or two things. The purpose of the whole session really is about how we value care, and does Ireland value care sufficiently, or are there particularities in the way we value care that are causing these kinds of inequalities and that are particularly causing gender inequalities? And I was very taken with Orla's point about the Constitution and the low status of care work in the Constitution. Well, look, when we think about what's in the Constitution around women in the home, etc., and how that is contributing to a low status for care work, or might be contributing for a low status for care work. I mean, I would love, I must say personally, to see the Irish Constitution contain an inclusive statement on care, because I'm convinced that at the root of all of this is the fact that we don't actually value care. We don't value those who give it, we don't value those who need it, and we don't value care as a kind of as a sphere of activity and a sphere of life. And we can look at COVID. We can look at what happened in COVID as a proof of that. we closed down more or less all the services, or a lot of the services. And what does that mean? Well, it was back to families. And when it goes back to families, it often goes to women. And secondly, we didn't value care enough, care given in care homes for older people. We didn't show great value of those in the way, you know, we didn't protect care homes really, and didn't prevent the virus entering care homes with the vigor we should. So that I think is one thing that I'd like us to discuss. And the other thing, or another thing, is Ireland, you know, is a strange welfare state really, in that it's such a transfer-oriented state, and all the work suggests that the transfers, the cash benefits, etc., the tax allowances, they do work. They make a big impact on poverty, and so Ireland always comes out near the top when you look at pre- and post-transfer poverty rates. And that's great that we have that. But then the other side of that is that we have a very underdeveloped service provision, and we don't have a history of public service provision in particular. And so, you know, my question is, or a question for all of us, is how do we move beyond the block that seems to be in Ireland around public service provision? And you can see it in the childcare, for example. You know, we use public money to finance private childcare. Why don't we use public money to finance public childcare? Is one question. And then third point I just want to make is, I was very struck in the report, Robert, about the social class differences through income, you know, where you showed us on the slides how women and men are differently placed depending on the income. And that, of course, brings up the question of intersectionality. And as you know, and probably everybody knows, intersectionality refers to the intersection of different types of equality or inequality. So gender and race, for example, gender, race, migrant background, gender, class, and so forth. And that's kind of part of the complexity, I think. And I just wanted to put that out there, that in fact, you know, thinking of women or indeed of men in kind of singular terms hides an awful lot. And I appreciated in the report that you tried to bring a class-based point to it. And of course, Orla mentioned the Migrant Workers Great Care Project, and that brings in, I suppose, in some ways, nationality and perhaps also ethnic differences. So maybe, Robert, you would like to contribute, and I have one or two questions on the chat that I can ask at this stage. But would you like, Robert, to just say a few words? Perhaps?
Yeah, I'll just respond to some of the points Jennifer made. She's right. I didn't go into in the Irish chapter so much some of the pressures that are on, say, professional women, and how the fact that, you know, the expectations that they will do the predominant amount of caring acts as a barrier to their careers. But I did talk about that quite a bit in the European chapter in particular. And and one of the arguments that I made is that workplaces need to be more facilitative of part-time work, basically. And there is an example of this. So I don't want to preempt the European chapter too much, but basically one example that's sometimes given is the pharmaceutical sector in the United States. So in the 1980s, most pharmacies were traditional kind of mom and pops stores, which meant that they were run by individual entrepreneurs, and which meant that you had to work very long hours in order to actually make it in that profession. However, throughout the 1980s and the 1990s and into the 2000s, the sector gradually moved from a kind of mom and pop individual entrepreneurial model to a more, franchise chain models. And the result of that was that it was much more easy to do part-time work and still survive in the sector. And as a result of the sector becoming much more facilitative of part-time work, the amount of women who entered into the sector increased a lot. And also, because it became much more facilitating and less penalizing of part-time work, the gender pay gap actually diminished I mean, there's almost no gender pay gap within the pharmaceutical sector in the United States due to that change and it becoming more facilitative of part-time work. And another factor that very few people actually talk about is the kind of cultural shifts that have happened in the last, even in my lifetime, I'm in my late 30s, and longer than that, because I grew up in a relatively small town in Tramore in County Waterford, but every day after school, I would just go out and play with my friends and, play football. And even when I was younger, I'd be like messing around on building sites and just all sorts of nonsense. But today that's completely lost. Everything now is structured. People organize play dates with each other. And the idea that you just leave children, obviously children still need to be supervised, but the idea that you just leave children go out and play with their friends, it has kind of been lost. So that there's been a strong decline in unsupervised play time among children across the developed world. And that puts pressure on families, and it puts pressure on women in particular. So that's another thing that people don't think about, is that, well, we need also to, maybe we don't have to organize play dates and be the perfect parents all the time as well.
Thank you, Robert. I have some questions on the chat that I would like, they're primarily to you, I think, as the author of the report. The first one is from Diana O'Dwyer, and Diana wonders how the privatized nature of childcare in Ireland and lack of public childcare compared to other European countries, and are low pay and no sick pay typical? I think that's something you do answer in the report.
Yes, I don't know how typical no sick pay is, but there is variation across countries in the terms and conditions of childcare / early years workers. So yeah, when you rely on a private model, the thing is, for a variety of reasons, care is time and labor intensive. But also importantly, if care becomes too expensive for families, ultimately that will be performed in the home. There's a trade-off. Ultimately, it becomes economical to do that care in the home. So those are among the factors. There's lots of factors that push down pay and conditions in the sector, but it's not inevitable. So I compare Ireland to Denmark briefly. So in Denmark, and the reason why I'm trying to get away from the word childcare worker is because in other countries, especially the Nordic countries, many people who work with young children are actually classified as so-called early year pedagogues. They're not just deemed childcare workers, and that their salaries are, just a little bit below, maybe 8% or something like that, below primary school teachers. So it isn't inevitable, but that would require a significant increase in public resources.
I think it's important to say, though, about the transfer to investment ratio as well. While it's not in any sense appropriately balanced now, it is so much improved from where it was 10 years ago, where it was nearly exclusively cash transfers to families. And the big shift came with the creation of the ECHE scheme, basically a preschool year, which was then extended to a second preschool year. And there was a lot of families resistant to that. And of course, getting children into an early years environment like that, particularly at the age of 3, performs a childcare function for some, but of course it was a social intervention as well, targeted at those who were having, who needed intervention at an earlier stage, whether it was catching a hearing problem or something that wasn't being caught in the home, and providing a sort of a routine and structure. So that was a big change that happened 10 years ago, and it's been expanded. So that balance has changed over time. It needs to be more, but.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer and Robert. I want to give some time. Kathleen Lynch, who is a well-known author and scholar in this field, has written a number of comments in the chat that I want to read out. And they're, in a way, questions about the assumptions in the report, Robert, and the kind of the way you proceed, particularly in understanding the care economy. And Kathleen, first of all, points out, I suppose, rather than just focusing on the exchange, on its exchange value. Care has a use value, and by that she means that it's actually life producing in and of itself. And she therefore questions whether the approach you take is possible. Does it really get at the kind of fundamental contribution of care in terms of the use value of care? That's one comment, and there's actually a number of others. So let me just, staying on from Kathleen. So, I mean, she has a question here, which is that, and there are a number of other comments, modern economies reward activities that extract value rather than create it. How can we push for cultural change that is needed in order to shed light on the immense value the care economy brings to our societies? And maybe Orla could also comment on that, because it seems to chime very well, Orla, with some of the points you made. It's also a question directed at Robert, though, and his kind of approach to the study of the care economy. And maybe it's a question at root about, is the care economy that useful a concept at the end of the day? Does it bypass all of the other elements of care that Kathleen and others are so concerned about? So maybe Robert might go first, and then you, Orla, and if Jennifer has any comments, we'd be glad to hear them. And this probably will be the end of this part of the session, because we're nearly out of time.
So the idea of talking about productivity was just to understand why wages in the care sector are low. So it does seem kind of wrong to use metrics and talk about productivity in terms of care work. So like sometimes, like in the report, I say that, like I put it in kind of inverted commas, like productivity in the care sector is low. And I just wanted to discuss that, because that does explain why it's a major factor as to why wages in the sector are low. But I absolutely agree that we shouldn't, look at care through the lens of productivity, and that it is, essential for the sustenance and reproduction of society. But it was just trying to understand why, compared to other professions, why wages tend to be low. And, as I said, it's not inevitable, but when you leave it to market forces, because primarily, but not exclusively, because of low productivity, care work tends to be poorly paid. I'll leave the social change part to Orla, perhaps.
Okay, Orla, please. Thank you, Robert.
I think the point Kathleen is raising is really important, and it's, I suppose, part of what we were trying to capture in the Women's Council in terms of, recognising the value of care to the common good in the Constitution as being a really important value to capture. Because yes, I mean, there is pieces where I think we can talk about the care economy, but there is that whole intrinsic piece about the value of care for all our lives. And, I'm really struck, particularly in a lot of the conversations with women and our members around COVID, just not being able to see people, not being able to have the contacts maybe that people had, has brought up a whole new conversation about care and how important it is for us all to receive care and also to give care. I think what Kathleen is raising is critical to this. It's not an either or, because there are pieces that are monetized. And I also think the other piece that Kathleen is raising, which is so correct, and often we don't think of when we talk about care, is that there are aspects in our economy that are also about care, and Kathleen mentions them in terms of healthcare that is absolutely recognised and paid substantially. So there's something as well about the different types of care. And how some are valued in a monetary way in comparison to where others aren't. So I think they are really, I think they're really important points. But I would say, I mean, I certainly think this whole debate about our Constitution puts that piece about how we value care within our society in a different place. And I'm very conscious that often, and I can see it, I can see it already in terms of some of the conversations around it, it gets brought into a care work context. And I think what we're trying to do is to raise it above that. Yes, the sort of care work is one part of it, but we need to have a much wider conversation about the importance and the value. Like it's a value piece about care. Thank you.
This is why I keep going back to the private sector experience as a counterpoint to the dominance of the way this conversation has been so far, because a referendum of that nature is going to have to encapsulate that. We're talking about care as a value. I totally agree with Orla on all of that. Care as a value and care as an activity is a life-affirming activity in itself as well. I don't want to outsource the care of my child. I don't want to entirely outsource the care of a sick parent. I want that to be part of my life. But I also want to do these other things. And we have to reconceive care and the value of care as part of our overall economic activity. Again, if you go back to the private sector, you know, and you take a personal example, you have two parents working 5 days a week, they have a second young child, and the mother then goes to a 3-day week because that's culturally acceptable for her, with all of the implications for her own self, for her pay, for her pension, for her opportunities. What's not normalized is that her husband goes back into a corporate environment and looks for a 4-day week, and that she looks for a 4-day week, that they reduce the experience, and that they are both contributing to the life-affirming nature of caring for their children and raising their children and having the social benefits of the time with their children. So you have to talk about this conversation as well, because that has to become normalized culturally within the corporate sector, within both genders. When that becomes visibly acceptable right throughout male-dominated organizations and commercial organizations, I think you can have a bigger cultural effect.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We're almost at the end, but there's another comment and question that I'd like to add in, and it's, I think, a really good note to end on because it's radical, and it's from Kate Kenny, and Kate directs this to both Robert and Orla, and perhaps you also, Jennifer. And she suggests that is it time, or she's asking, is it time for a more radical action on the part of carers in the home and in paid work, ? And she makes reference to social reproduction theory, the economy, which points out that the economy collapses without care, which we all know. And she's wondering, are there examples of other places in which some form of a strike or withdrawal has been used in order for care to gain the respect and reward it merits? What about a care strike?
Well, I mean, just prior to the election, what we are seeing in Ireland is a much greater organisation of childcare workers. And we had the Childcare March, which was, you know, a really phenomenal activity all over the country where, you know, many early years workers stopped working and parents supported them in doing it because we wanted to see action. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with Kate that we do need strong, forceful action and very visible action, because I think so much of care work can be invisible. And also because I know for many of those early years workers, you know, they really thought a lot about doing that because, you know, they didn't want to be there not providing care. So I absolutely agree that we need much more powerful collective action on this, because, you know, I'm very conscious, and I was very conscious of it yesterday in terms of the budget. You know, the reason nothing happened in this budget was we were told there's another comprehensive review of childcare in Ireland. Now, I believe childcare has been comprehensively reviewed for decades and leading to very little action in many circumstances. We don't need reviews, we need decisive action.
Thank you, Orla. Maybe Jennifer, would you like to say just shortly, please?
I don't have any problem with radical action. You know, we don't value care until we either need it or until we're doing it. But I don't believe it's just a paid care revolt that's necessary. Remember back to the South African Parliament when there was no creche and all the women brought in their children one day on the same day? Well, they found a creche pretty quickly afterwards. Sometimes radical action is very effective. But it's not just for paid childcare workers. What would that mean to everybody's family? And they'd only have to do the work again later. But you know what I mean? It's a much bigger thing than just the paid sector.
Robert, you can have the last word here.
Yeah, well, I would agree that, you know, especially with Orla's point that there has been, you know, increased action and marches for the early year sector in particular. I mean, one thing that does come across is that, and maybe less so childcare workers, but a lot of care workers are often very reluctant to go on strike because you know, they don't want to harm the people they're caring for. So I think it needs a broad support from society, and I think that support is growing.
Thank you very much. Just maybe to make one kind of point that dawned on me, you know, in the academic literature on welfare state growth and development, the fall of fertility in so many countries is actually interpreted as a strike by women not to have babies, you know, and that's an interesting take. And that has led the countries like Germany and so forth that were very dependent on women being home to take care of children, that has led them to really radicalize their provisions. So there is an interesting kind of undercurrent here about how we strike and what we do that actually makes change. So I have to end this session now, I believe. Can I thank everybody who's participated in it, Orla and Jennifer in particular, and also Robert, of course, for the excellent report and for the excellent presentation. And I'd also like to thank the people who participated with questions. We couldn't hear from you face to face, unfortunately, but your questions are with us and will remain with us. So thank you very much. I'm proposing that we take about 5 minutes and no more than 5 minutes, which means by my clock that you'll have to come back at 11:43 Irish time or 12:43 Brussels time for the next session. So thank you very much. Can I welcome everybody back to the second part of this session on care and whether we care sufficiently about care. And now we turn the lens on Europe, on the EU in particular. And this, of course, is also covered in the report. And we will have about 50 minutes, I think, left for first a presentation of the relevant sections of the report from Letitia Thiessen. And Letitia is representing, in a way, the second partner of this report, which is the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And Letitia is a gender equality policy advisor with the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And she's going to talk for around 15 minutes, and then we'll have a panel. And finally, we'll have a closing statement from the head of task, Shana Cohen, and also from Renate Tenbush, who's the director of the FES office in Brussels. So Letitia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and it's my pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. I'm going to present, as you mentioned, the EU chapter of the Cherishing All Equally 2020 report on inequality and the care economy. So, as the report is indicating, care has huge implications for inequality. The distribution of care work has a central role in the formation of inequality between women and men. Women, because they bear the disproportionate burden of care work, have often been excluded from political and economic life, but also from voluntary culture and leisure activity. And this unequal distribution of care is perhaps the single largest factor in the continuation of gender inequalities in modern societies. So as Europe emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, a long overdue conversation needs to be had about the value that we place on care work. This part of the report is therefore examining inequalities and the care economy in the EU along two main dimensions. The first one is, how do systems of care provisions affect economic inequality between men and women, looking at both total earning differences and the gender pay gap. Secondly, it looks at the working conditions of care workers by comparing carers to the workforce at large. And thirdly, in light of this analysis, it examines the policy implications of it. So moving to the first component, which looks at care economy and gender equality, we find out that it is a very complex relationship. In fact, the care economy has an overall positive impact on the economic equality between the sexes. Countries with more expensive systems of care, with the infrastructural and administrative apparatus to support that care, have smaller overall earning differences between women and men. The care economy is indeed an important source of women's employment. However, on the other hand, by providing more opportunities for women to work in stereotypically female occupations, it contributes to the segregation of the labor market. So as female-dominated sectors and face-to-face services generally tend to be poorly paid, the gender pay gap increases as a result. So one of the main conclusions that we can already draw from this report is that care plays a very complicated role in the gender pay gap. Now, there are many definitions of care work. Many of them are contested, and very often they are country-specific. But if we look at the ILO definition, it includes not only paid care, but also unpaid care. And in that sense, it can cover a range of activities from caring for the children, the old, the disabled, the sick, and it may also include activities such as cooking and cleaning. The inclusion of care workers together with healthcare workers such as doctors and nurses, along with administrators in the whole sector, contribute what we call the broader care economy. And there are several ways through which the system of care in a country may either expand or limit women's economic opportunities. First of all, it is a major source of employment for women. And secondly, it is an important factor to the extent to which it encourages part-time work. Looking at the gender pay gap, looking at the earning gaps, which refers to the differences in earnings between women and men, we see that at the EU level, the differences in hourly pay, so what we commonly know as the gender pay gap, is the single most important factor, but only marginally so, with 41%. It is immediately followed by the employment gap, which is 38%, and then the hours gap of 21%. As indeed we know that women tend to work in higher proportion in part-time work. The average earning differences, as is highlighted in the report between men and women, is 33%. So in other words, men earn 1/3 more than women. And two key findings that we should remember from this report is that countries which tend to be egalitarian in terms of labor force participation often have large gender pay gaps. And secondly, when the female labor force participation is comparatively low, the gender pay gap is small as well. Now, this table offers an extra understanding on how care affects economic inequality and how care is actually the most important occupation in understanding differences in the employment gap. And in fact, due to the fact that care tends to be often poorly paid, its direct contribution to the earning gap is less than its significance to the employment gap overall. Now, if we turn at the gender pay gap, which is the most important driver of overall earning differences between men and women, as we have just seen, we need to put this in relationship to the issue of care and how does the gender pay gap interact with care. Well, first of all, there is an important element which relates to occupational segregation and the fact that women tend to be concentrated in the care sector, which also turns out to be a less well-paid sector. And secondly, we have the motherhood penalty, which is the pay penalty that women suffer after the birth of a child. But what is of particular interest here is how the burden of caring is penalizing women's earning. So if you look at the graph, you see that the white points lie above the black points, which indicates that young mothers earn less than young women, generally speaking, and themselves in turn earn less than men under 30. However, what's also interesting to note is that countries with comprehensive systems of affordable childcare, such as the Nordics, have smaller motherhood penalties. So you see, for instance, Finland and the Netherlands in the table, where the gap is actually negative, meaning that mothers under 30 earn more than men in the same group. And Finland indeed has a more generous childcare coverage and parental leave. On the opposite side, you can also see that motherhood penalty is largest in Lithuania and Hungary, where childcare provision tends to be less extensive. This other figure shows the relationship between female employment rate and the gender pay gap. Though the relationship is not strong, it is clearly positive. So in other words, countries with high levels of female employment tend to have higher gender pay gaps. Now moving to the second dimension of this report, what it also does is that it offers us a sketch of the profile of care workers by focusing on the working conditions of care workers. So of course we need to acknowledge differences between different countries, but here are the main features that we can identify. First of all, there is considerable variation in the size and composition of the care workforce across EU member states. And the care employment is also highly gendered. In fact, on average, only 7% of childcare or early years workers are male. Thirdly, care work is highly reliant on immigrant labor. And this further stigmatizes and diminishes the value society places on it. And you will see here in the graph, for instance, that in Italy, close to half of care workers are born outside of the country. A fourth point to be mentioned is that immigrant labor comprises only a small part of the care employment among poorer countries of the EU. And here an important note needs to be made about informal work, as in fact surveys often underestimate the informal or undeclared work, which is likely to be a problem in poor countries and in countries with high levels of cross-border workers. Then we also see that the average figure of the member states is for care to earn around 65%. So that means that around 2/3 of the national average of the employee income. And for most of the countries, childcare or early care workers are less well paid than the elder care and disability workers. So here again, we see important variations, both in terms of member state representation, but also within the care sector itself. Then, when we look at the precarious work of care workers, we see that the extent to which care workers experience precariousness changes significantly across member states. Therefore, trends are somehow in line with the expectations based on welfare state typology, and the size of the care sector conforms well to the welfare regimes. But when we consider the job quality of care workers, we need to go beyond the pay and contractual conditions, as emotional and social environment is important as well. And here, care work can indeed be an important source of stress in several ways. We see, for instance, that it impacts the adverse emotional conditions of care workers. And the two most common complaints about carers are having to deal with angry clients and being in disturbing situations. And in almost all countries, the emotional environment is more adverse for carers compared to non-carers. Next, we also see that in countries where carers are significant, we also see that in most countries, carers are significantly more vulnerable to mistreatment than non-care workers. And here we see various forms of mistreatment, which include, perhaps surprisingly, in the largest share of it, physical violence. So we see that 9% of carers across the country report having experienced physical violence in the last 12 months. But there's also discrimination and sexual harassment that are important elements to take into account. The results as well indicate that care workers have a low degree of autonomy at work. And the most common complaint of care workers is that they are physically exhausted. In most countries, however, what is interesting to note as well is that care work is generally more fulfilling than non-care work. And in fact, 85% of care workers report the feeling of work being well done, and 91% of care workers feel that they do something useful. So the value that we place on care work in the market and by society bears very little resemblance to the reality of care work itself. This brings us to the third and last part of the EU chapter, which is considering the policy implications of reconciling inequalities with the care economy with balanced lives. So work-life preferences have a strong gender perspective, in the sense that women tend to be more adaptive and favor a desire or express a desire of a balance between work and life family, whereas men have traditionally tended to focus more on their career. However, what needs to be said, and what we find out in this report, is that men desire a greater role in caring. And additionally, there are substantial gender differences in the occupational value and preferences for job security and flexibility. So women clearly display a preference for working less and for greater part-time work. That doesn't mean that they are not career-oriented, but for instance, it is interesting to note that Nordic mothers are the most likely to state a desire to work less, and that is a reflection as women are more represented in paid employment in those regions. So therefore, it is questionable whether higher levels of labor force participation or higher rates of women in full-time work is a truly desirable goal across all countries. In higher participation countries, greater women participation should be facilitated, but not necessarily enforced through affordable childcare. And those stronger measures are to be coupled with stronger ones in those countries where women participation is usually lower, like in the case of the Southern European countries. We also need to stress that men desire to reduce their paid working time even more than women, although they still prefer longer paid hours than women do. And in that sense, a better reconciliation of a desire for balanced life and earnings inequality, would also focus on reducing the number of hours worked. Policy, additionally, should expand the economic and social rights of informal carers. An important element to be mentioned here also is the motherhood penalty that very often not only has an impact on women's pay, but also prevents them from applying to higher positions at work, whilst instead this is associated with a wage premium for fathers. And many traditional work environments are more favorable to male models of interactions. And so what can we do here in order to overcome the gender pay gaps? Well, diversity policies and gender quotas are and remain priorities. We are in need of family-friendly workplaces, and reforms are needed to pay setting and allocations that can help overcome those pay gaps. The report very much stresses also how occupational segregations influences the way that we value care, and the reason for these occupational segregations are multiple. But in order to improve the pay conditions of care workers, we also need to be aware that this would simply contribute to a more gender balanced workforce at large. And for that, care needs to be decommodified to become a well-paid profession. And this includes not only public provision to keep fees and costs down as wage increases, but also to de-link public pay from earnings that care workers receive in the private market. So here, overcoming institutional and cultural barriers to men entering the female-dominated professions is a key element, together with the elimination of continued poor pay and low status of female-dominated profession. So that was it for this very condensated summary of this chapter, providing you an overview on the care economy and how it affects inequality across the EU, which of course I very warmly invite you to look up in more details. And I look forward to the exchange that we are going to have now. Thank you for your attention. And this brings us to the next part of the program. Thank you. The floor is yours, Mary.
Thank you very much, Letitia. That was such a good overview of nearly 40 plus pages in the report around the European Union situation. So thank you so much. You really made it accessible to us, and I appreciate it very much. And this section of the report is as good as the last one is on Ireland. I thought it really revealed, as somebody who works in the field, I actually learned a lot from it, I have to say. So well done again, Robert and Letitia. We now move on to another panel discussion, and on this occasion, I mean, we have the title here, Does Europe Care for Care?, which is a very good topic of discussion. And we have two speakers, Lizia Radelicki, who is a cabinet member of the Commissioner Helena Dalli in the European Commission, and she's the Commissioner for Equality. So Lizia is well in this area of gender equality in particular. And then we have Marie Hupanen, who is based in Sweden. And Marie is a public health scientist and has a strong association. She's a trade unionist and particularly associated with the trade union Kommunal, which is the Swedish Municipal Workers Union, which I imagine is hugely important for care work in Sweden. So if I could invite each of you to give a short intervention, please. And if I could also invite the audience at this stage, because we will have time for some questions and answers. So if you have any questions, or points you'd like discussed further, can you put them on the chat or also on the chat associated with the YouTube? Thank you. So Lizia, you first, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me and having me participate in this discussion. And I was asked to give input on the report written, and I would say on the presentation given by Letitia, which was very clear and to the point. And what I wanted to say, and the report confirms that, is that care has two parts. One is care as a service, and the other part is care as an employer. Both important and equally important for women. And so what I would like to say, indeed, we need to invest in care because this helps creating employment also for women. It helps making sure that the care service can be of good quality, but we need to make sure that it is and remains accessible to everyone. And then a last point, by investing in care and therefore making sure there is also employment for women, that it also contributes on women participating to tax revenues, which then again we can invest even more afterwards. So that's the starting point. One of the issues that that Leticia mentioned extensively is the whole issue of the gender pay gap. Indeed, by investing in care, you also invest in giving the care sector better value, more value. So there is a need for doing that. And so two ways from our perspective that this can be done and that we are working on is the remuneration of workers in general. And so later this year, there will be the minimum wage that will be put forward as a proposal, and we will be putting forward the proposal on pay transparency, because by tackling the root issue of the gender pay gap, meaning pay discrimination, we can also work towards towards closing the gender pay gap. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because the gender pay gap that has multiple gaps. One of them is also in the care sector. We see that at the lower scales of the care sector, you have lots of women, and higher up you go towards decision making, the lower you have women represented in those posts. So that's also something that needs to be looked at. And so combating gender stereotypes in the care sector is also important, so that the lower maybe less well-paid positions in the care sector are not just filled by women and the higher position filled by men. The gender stereotyping also needs to be broken in terms of how we see certain positions, where nurses are still considered as nursing, so the more emotional accompanying part of the job, and doctors more considered as the ones that have the knowledge and tell us what to do. And so also there we need to combat that gender stereotypes and make sure that there is a balance in representation and what the jobs mean and what responsibilities they really have, and that both women and men are represented in these. I've mentioned pay transparency. I've mentioned the minimum wage as concrete measures that will be taken up by the Commission to combat the gender pay gap. I've mentioned the gender stereotyping. A couple of other issues that I wanted to put forward is we talked about what does care mean, and I think that often we think of care as childcare, and I think we need a lifelong approach towards this. It's not just about childcare; it's also about care for old people, care for people with disability, care for people that are dependent on us. And so that lifelong approach maybe needs to be better articulated so that it's not just about taking care of children. And Leticia also mentioned that in her presentation. And that brings me to the whole discussion of the work-life balance. And we have seen that during this pandemic, we have actually learned something out of this, and that is how to combine work and life, because we were all forced to do that from home. And so the whole teleworking that is often used as a good way of trying to combine work and life is indeed good and has been taken up by both women and men in this difficult situation. But we need to make sure that as we get out of the COVID, that teleworking is not something that is solely taken up by women while men go back to work and do not combine anymore both work and life responsibilities. So I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind. And the same goes for during COVID, we saw that member states had put forward special leaves, like corona leaves, for parents to be able to take care of their home, of the children, while children were still not able to go back to school. Again, in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw that equally men and women were taking up those special leaves. But as we were getting out of the lockdown and try to face a new normality, less men were taking it up and women continued taking it up. So I think that also there we need to be vigilant that we don't, that it's not just women that continue finding solutions to work-life balance approach, but that also men continue doing that. Because as Laetitia mentioned, indeed, if you look at statistics, men do are willing to take up leave options. What else? What I also wanted to say is, like, yeah, I mentioned the importance of quality care that needs to be ensured, so that it's everybody has the same care available. And so in that respect, but specifically on childcare, also the Commission will come up with shortly with a proposal on the child guarantee. So also there will be possibilities of looking into childcare. I think that's all from my side of observations that I wanted to share with you. I mean, as I said, the Work-Life Balance Directive has been adopted last year, so it is our task now in the coming years to look that this is implemented properly by the member states, and after that we will be able to see how this how successful Europe has been in this, and how it has maybe changed our societies in the long run.
Thank you very much, Licia. I mean, really important points. Just to underline the importance of, I'm so glad you raised the importance of gender stereotyping, because I think it is very prevalent in the whole care, the care field, whether that's paid or unpaid. And I'm also glad you mentioned children. I'm personally absolutely delighted that the child guarantee is going forward. It's such a progressive measure. And of course, an awful lot of gender and women's situation is around children. And so children have to be part, you know, how we provide for children has to be part of the whole care situation. I'd like to turn now to Mari Huppanen, as I said, who's Sweden and particularly associated with the Kommunal. Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having the opportunity to read this excellent report and listen to the presentations. Laetitia's presentation was really good, as well as Robert's. As said, my name is Mari Huppanen and I work as a researcher. My employer is the biggest public sector union in the Nordic countries called Kommunal, and we pretty much organized all the professional groups that weren't able to work from home. That biggest group being practical nurses, and that's the field I work with. I work with questions that have with elderly care, long-term care, healthcare, have to do with those questions. Some things that I thought about reading this report were how very much alike all the European countries sadly are, and not in a positive way. There was a sentence in the report that said that care workers everywhere in Europe are exhausted all the time. That seems like a beginning of a fantastic revolution. And I think it was, even though these times are so tough, and these times are so tough for especially the essential workers, those who work in healthcare or elderly care, this is like the last minute call for all the politicians to see how important the care work is, and also how lacking in finance, lacking in staff, and in skills and competence education this branch of care work has been. So I hope really that the corona crisis will lead to something positive, being a value. The politicians will finally see the value of care work. Those are the biggest lessons we should learn. I really love that the report considered this skilled work, unskilled work, low skilled work thoughts, because that's my main fight in this life, is pointing that the care work is not low skilled work. It's very much skilled work. It's work that demands a lot of formal skills as well as practical skill. For example, in Sweden, it's the group that gets, even though Sweden is a classical, like a good welfare society, it's becoming smaller and smaller, the group of elderly who, for example, get elderly care. So the group that gets these services are very sick. They often have multi-morbidity issues. They have diabetes, they have heart problems, as well as dementia. So it's really skilled work to take care of that kind of, and not only having skills to take care of this group, also that your working conditions are so horrible that you have too few colleagues, you have maybe a boss that doesn't trust you, you don't have a safe employment contract, that you have to day by day go on different kind of temporary contracts. That's something that every European country has to fix. I also want to take my few minutes to comment on a few things that trade unions could do in helping to lift the status and the value of care work. Something that we have worked a lot with in Sweden has been that we have worked with standardizing the skill levels, that we want to lift the level of skill, that we have to demand a vocational education to work as a care worker, which is a practical nurse in Sweden. So that's something that we have done together with the politicians. Also to help finance this kind of a good quality education to all of the care workers is something that we are working on. And of course, by collective bargaining. And thereby, even though Sweden has, especially in this field, we have a high percentage of organized labor, but still, if everyone would get like the same pay raise every time we have a collective bargaining, we would always have this pay gap between the female workforce who work in healthcare or elderly care and the blue-collar male jobs as car mechanic or metal work or something like that. And that's why we have done this once, and we are really trying to do it again this year. We want to invest an extra percentage to the female care workers, or not, of course, also males who work in the care branch, but like the care worker, which is called undersköterskesatsning, practical nurse investment. So it's a part of the collective bargaining, but we want to lift the group of people who have vocational education, so we could lift the whole status of the female care work. But like there needs to be a lot of political things happening before we are before the world is complete. The austerity has to end. Politicians have to see the value in care work, and they have to invest money in care. That was pretty much all I wanted to say today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Marie. I mean, the Nordic countries are probably gifted in many ways, but one way is in which care workers are actually organized, and trade unions are actively involved with care workers. And, you know, one of the problems, for example, in the UK and Ireland is that care workers are not organized really, or organized in sufficient numbers in trade unions. So it is good that you emphasize the role of trade unions. I have a question. I have actually two questions, and perhaps I'll put one is for both of you and one is for Lesia. And the first is from Martin Tobias Schmidt, who raises the point about the transfer of caring responsibilities to migrant women in particular, and migrant workers in particular. And as we know, these workers are, it was clear from the report, they're very heavily relied on in some member states. And Martin Tobias is wondering, how can we stop this vicious circle of, you know, bringing, let's say, if I could use the word, native women into the labor market, which in turn requires that or opens opportunities for migrant women to either care in the home or provide care in some other setting. But these people are not well paid. And, you know, do you see the vicious circle he's talking about? And I wondered if you both, perhaps Marie, you have your microphone off, so maybe you would speak first, and then Lesia, I think he would like you to speak to that as well. We have only a short time, so I would ask you to be short, please.
I'll be really quick. I think everything has to do with raising the status and raising the, also offering education and like lifting the status of the care sector. That is not so much of a care migrant workforce. It's not very big thing in Sweden actually. There's a lot of people working in care sector who have a migrant background, but it's not so much of a I think the thresholds in the Swedish labor market are very high, so they probably, that kind of pay competition is not something that's very much happening in Sweden, but I think it has to do with the status and the financing of the care sector very much.
Thank you, Marie. What about you, Lesia? How would you reply to that question?
I think I mean, it's similar to what Marie said. I mean, it's about investing in the care sector, and investing in the care sector means valuing the work, how it contributes to our society. It is valuing the work that the people in the care sector do, and that means, yeah, also looking at the issue of wages. It means also valuing the fact that it needs skilling, upskilling, reskilling, education. And I think, yeah, it's all interconnected. So investing in the care sector is a must, I think. And I think that the COVID crisis has highlighted that enormously. I just would like to add one thing that I wanted to say earlier on, and it's about, I think it's important indeed to shift the unpaid work and unpaid care work to paid and recognized care work. So make it as a profession, and to be careful with the remuneration of care at home, in the sense that this could maybe slip into paying mothers to stay at home. And I think we need to make sure that this is carefully looked at, that it doesn't turn into, making, remunerating women to stay at home and take care, but that care is seen as a profession.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. It's a very tricky balance to get right, isn't it? Valuing care in the family and not consolidating women as mothers or as only mothers and carers. There is one other question for you, Lizzie, and it's about the EU, how can the EU ensure minimum standards across member states when it comes to the provision of care, as well as the working conditions involved in the sector? So what can the EU do you think, around minimum standards?
Well, as I mentioned before, I mean, one of the issues that the Commission will be putting forward is the proposal on minimum wage. So that's a very concrete issue. I mean, it's not just for the care sector, but it will also touch, it will touch all sectors. So that's one thing. Then in terms of standards, what has been done already this year is that the Commission had put forward a package on the skills agenda, the vocational training, and that's the starting point, making sure that at that level already we start with a common approach in training for nurses, doctors, carers, and so forth. That's one thing, and then in the whole socioeconomic sphere next year, the Commission will be putting forward its action plan on the social pillar, and there will be a social summit, and that's an opportunity for the Commission also to look at those things. So yeah.
Something is happening then, in other words. Hopefully watch this space. We'll see some real changes. Can I thank you both very much? And can I thank you to Letitia for really superb presentation, and also to the people who posed questions. My job is done now. I hand over for the concluding remarks, to Shana Cohen, who's the Director of Task, and also to Renata Tenbush, who's the Director of the FES office in Brussels. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. And I just want to, I'm not going to speak for very long. I just wanted to thank everybody for participating. I found this event on a personal level very, very interesting. I thought it was excellent. I want to thank Rob, whom I work with at Task. He did a brilliant job in this report. I kind of threw it on him a while ago as a topic because it's quite personal for me. I have 2 children and I've used all kinds of care, kinds of facilities in my career. And I remember, and I want to thank FEPS for funding it. I remember talking to Lisa Kastner about the project when she was working at FEPS. I was proposing it to her, and I was finishing the conversation with her, and my kids were coming home, and my husband was in the UK where he works. And so I was trying to negotiate my kids coming home, needing something to eat, my work, and then when I could stop, and then when I could start again with work, because after I managed my care responsibilities. And like Jennifer, whom I really related to what she said about the just what it means to identify as a carer. It's not obvious to identify as a carer. I think I identify as a mother, and I have 2 children, and my entire life is oriented around their needs, but it's not something that is respected in the workplace. And I found that on a personal level over and over again. So if something could happen to make it more respected in the workplace, at least for people who are women who are younger than I am, then that would be fantastic. Because you should be able to be a mother and to use care facilities, but maybe you don't want to work full-time until they're of a certain age, and that should be respected. I personally didn't work full-time until my younger son was in school. But people, it is a balance between the cost of childcare and staying in your career. But if you leave, particularly in the profession that I'm in, if you leave your job, then you have trouble getting back into it. So So obviously this is a very personal issue for me. And I think in some ways I couldn't have done a report on it. So I thank Rob for doing it. He did a fantastic job, but it's something that is needs to move forward. I think particularly because of the pandemic and the lockdown, I think that the burden of care, all across national context, the burden of care seems to have fallen back on women. And then because moving forward with any economic recovery, you're going to want women to go back to work. And so there needs to be high quality, affordable care that is flexible for the woman and both parents' needs, but also their desires as a parent. If they want to work full time or if they want to work part time, then they should have adequate access to care, but that workplaces should respect those choices. Anyway, I just want to thank FEPS for funding this project. It has meant quite a lot to me, and I really appreciate everybody having participated in the event. And I will turn it over to the head of Friederike Bert to give the final comments. Is that?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, just checking. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear and see me. Yeah, let me also thank you, everybody, in particular Task, for putting together this really interesting and fascinating report. Thanking FEPS, our partner in a very important project, which I would like to inform you a little bit about. I will make it really short because I'm the one here to switch the light off, as we say in Germany. So yes, thanks to everybody. Thanks to my team also, yeah, who is also part of this project in a way. And yeah, I mentioned it already. That is why we are also here involved today and why I'm speaking a little bit here. It's because we are running together with FEPS a project that is called Feminist Europe. Does Europe Care for Care? And yeah, we just heard it again. Care regimes in Europe, as diverse as they may be, have failed to bring care to the core of their economies and also or attaching the high value to care activities that it actually earns. And Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Brussels office, but also our whole network in Germany and in the European Union, together with the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, FEPS, embarked on a journey exploring how a feminist Europe can be achieved. And we joined together to this project on Feminist Europe, Does Europe Care for Care? And at the core of this project is a wide pool of care experts. And through this network and together with FES offices, FEPS member foundations and partner organizations, we monitor the European gender equality strategy through a progressive lens and with a particular focus on its care dimension. And in our EU Care for Care roadshow, which just started, we will highlight together with our experts from all over Europe the many aspects of care work from a European and various national perspectives. And with the insights gained from these events, and also an event which is very important in this relation, what we had here today and from the report, we will develop concrete policy recommendations for national policies and the EU equality strategy in order to build a Europe where care work is fairly distributed and also becomes crisis-proof with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, what we heard a lot about. So that is just to explain why are we here today, how we are involved with FEPS, and we thought definitely that this event here today and the discussions that I followed and I found intriguing and are really very much fit into this project, and that is why we are also part here of this project today. So thanks again to everybody. That's also my task, not only to the team of FEPS, headed by Laszlo Ander, who did the opening, but also many thanks to Mary Daly, who did a great job on moderating these two exciting panels. And I would like to thank all the panelists once again, also from this point for this, for their contributions and for really having this interesting and fascinating debate. And Also on a personal level, I worked in many different environments in, for example, also India and South Africa, and we worked very closely with this in different gender projects, also with what we call the domestic sector, organizing the domestic sector, and as you probably know, as well in India, as well as in South Africa, these women are doing the main work in the households, and they are not organized. And I mean, we come across this issue of care, and this situation there is obviously very different. What I was surprised about is to hear that in one of the statistics at the beginning of the first panel that we saw that in Germany, the distribution, we were ranking quite low when it came to the distribution of care work and public work or professional work, in particular also in comparison to France. And yeah, that was for me surprising, because the debate in Germany is quite going into another direction, because there's a lot of complaint that, first of all, not so many women are in the working sector as, for example, in France, because care for childcare and so on is not provided enough. And yes, we had a radical change, but we are still discussing also that issue in Germany, and there's still a lot to do. So I will close now. I will switch off the light, and I would like to thank everybody really around who came together here on this very important issue to discuss it. And thanks again for those who put together the report. Thanks a lot. It will help our work. Goodbye. I can't see anybody anymore, so I'm finished. Bye.